wait till it's too late. Don't wait till it's too late.
Don't wait until it's too late.
Our next speaker, I'm proud to introduce, is Jerry Mander. Lives in Bolinas. He's the founder of the International Forum on Globalization. Back in the 90s, the International Forum on Globalization started some teach-ins to raise awareness on what was the WTO, what the corporations were attempting to do. And when Seattle came, they were very instrumental in shutting down the WTO. And through the years, it's a think tank that has tremendous impact. They gave put on another teach-in a couple years ago called the Triple Global Crisis, on climate change, peak oil, and species extinction. And Jerry's just been a force in raising awareness around the world, and he'll give us a global perspective on climate change. Jerry Mander.
Being asked me to speak about the global economy and the principles of capitalism and globalization and the negotiations in Copenhagen and the domestic policy in the White House, and to say something about the local economy also. So I was given 10 minutes to do that. So what I thought I'd better do, though, is write it out, because, So I'm sorry I'm going to actually read to you. I realize that's uncool in an informal setting like this, but it'll work out better than if I try to get all that in and wing it at the same time. So, thanks, Bing, for inviting me. There you are. Isn't Bing amazing, actually? And all the people who are moving the transitions here to localization, Bernie and Bing and Megan and Norm Solomon and Jan Markle. I can't think of all the names, but this is the community is really motivated to make these transitions, and we emphasize local systems, local food systems, local governance, local transport, local resource, and this is probably the most important thing that communities can do right now, is to take charge of what we can take charge of. Localization is the path to the future, and we need to really do our homework now while it's possible and rebuild our local systems so that they're stable and can function over the long term. Crises we face like climate change make that, of course, all the more urgent. They help us understand that the macroeconomy in which we are increasingly embedded cannot sustain itself for much longer. It's built on entirely false premises. In a world of diminishing resources and planetary limits, globalization is based on a set of economic assumptions that are no longer valid and will soon collapse. In fact, it's already beginning to collapse. So local action is really primary. It's more doable, it's more achievable, it's not limited by ideological corporate frameworks. It's inherently less dependent on long-distance transport, giant global finance, distant rules of organization and behavior. And best of all, it's inherently more democratic, participatory, inclusive, collective, and community-based. All those things are why I better just shove these papers in my pocket, turning toward the local. But it's crucial that as we work on localization, we have to keep one eye and part of our minds on the realization that it's not enough. There really finally is no way to separate ourselves from climate change or ocean pollution or the global depletion of resources. If the Pacific Islands are not saved from rising waters, if the water tables in China continue to dry and are not renewed, if the Antarctica ice melts, if the global fish supply is depleted, if we don't immediately find sustainable, workable alternative energy systems, if there's expanded soil depletion from industrial agriculture and starvation and migration, if the indigenous peoples of the Amazon are prevented from continuing to protect their forests, which are the last great carbon sinks that we have left on Earth, these will affect us right here in West Marin. We've never been more connected than we are today. Like it or not, we're still embedded in that larger system. And in the modern world of transportation and communications and instantaneous financial transactions, push-button economic transfers, the wind is blowing, so I'm trying to be careful. In such a world, we're attached to the global system like Siamese twins, more than ever before. So while we do our local work, we should be cognizant and educated about the larger global system, local and global, and I guess that's why Bing wanted me to talk about that. And I'm grateful for the opportunity. Bing mentioned that 4 years ago at IFG, we did a gigantic teaching in Washington, D.C. on these matters. Bing and some others, Jim Heddle, among you, were there for every minute on what we called the triple crisis. That is, it's not only climate change, but it's also peak oil, that is to say peak fossil fuels, global depletion of our current fuel supplies, as well as overall resource depletion, water, soils, clean air, forests, minerals, life in the seas, biodiversity. What we pointed out at that time was that all these global problems are basically the same problem. They're rooted in the same assumptions. We either begin to address that fundamental problem or we face a very grim future. So far, however, whether in Washington, D.C., even with our dear Barack Obama, or in Copenhagen and in most other world capitals, the powers that be are not nearly beginning to face the problem. They still think they can wise-ass their way around it. Why are they trying to do that? Well, one big reason is that all global powers, governments, corporations, banks, international economic institutions, are far more unified in their commitment to saving present global economic structures, corporations, and operating assumptions, which are intrinsically opposed to real solutions. More united in that than they are unified on the need for a good climate deal. Advocating massive reforms in the behavior and structures of global capitalism is not yet a great strategic political platform on which anyone wants to run for prime minister or World Bank chief or president of the United States, or Marine supervisor probably, though maybe Steve Kinsey wants to. Maybe he wants to run his next campaign on that. We'll see. At our teach-in, speaker after speaker went to great pains to amplify the root causes of the current crisis. We published them in a wonderful report, Manifesto on Global Economic Transitions. I'm going to wave that at you in a few minutes. But you can download it for free from our website, ifg.org. You probably know the major causes, but they're not really mysterious, but here are just 6 of the top ones. The dominant economic paradigm and system, which is now ubiquitous on the planet, that places always increasing rapid economic growth at the height of national and personal aspirations. 2, the global promotion of commodity-oriented economic systems that promote ever-expanding consumerism as primary to individual happiness and fulfillment, a highly doubtful proposition. 3, to fuel that growth, a planet-wide race to exploit natural resources in their last hiding places, whether it's the forests of the Amazon or Indonesia or the Pacific Islands, or whomsoever's land they happen to be on, water, fuels, forests, arable soils, minerals, and uncontrolled, insane use of fossil fuels to feed that growth. 4, a history of massive global inequities in seeking and controlling these resources and their historic benefits based on centuries of colonialism and exploitation, which continue today and are partly at the heart of the problem in the global negotiations today, as I'll get to. 5, profound disregard for planetary limits in terms of resource availability, material and energy throughput, consumption, transportation, waste generation and absorption, and overpopulation, which makes everything else worse. Of all these, it's the hyper, never-ending growth which is the central tenet. It's the lifeblood of corporate capitalism. It's the bottom line. How to build it, how to sustain it, how to protect it. Growth rates determine the rate of corporate investment, the stock values of the corporation, the dividends paid out, the profits, the ability to expand activities, and the salaries and bonuses of the CEOs. Without hypergrowth, the system collapses. The ideas of limits to growth is heresy. The idea of limits to growth is heresy. The idea of planetary limits is unheard of. All of this despite the fact that the very concept of never-ending economic growth on a planet of finite size is preposterous and more than a little bit insane. Of course, during much of the 20th century, we did live in a world of resource abundance. So it was then possible to achieve high rates of continuous growth. But that's over now. As Richard Heinberg says, the party's over. On a finite planet, it cannot go on forever. It's crazy to think otherwise. The end of the line begins to be in view. We're rapidly running out of oil, natural gas, cheap coal is disappearing, fresh water, forests, life in the seas, and of course there's climate change. As the supplies of these diminish, the costs inevitably dramatically increase. Remaining supplies may be in ever more remote places, more difficult to recover, and far more expensive. Did you see that the United States military is now bombing the moon? How many people saw that story? Looking for new supplies of fresh water? The disappearing supply of fresh water is likely to be a bigger long-term crisis than climate change, and people are barely talking about it. Also, we've just seen a remarkable aspect of the conundrum caused by the end of global expansion in the recent recession, where the entire economy contracted. Most corporations contracted too. It produced a gigantic freakout for the entire system that we've all just witnessed, where us poor taxpayers had to pay these corporations so they could retain some semblance of stability. But curiously, if you notice, during this time of recession, the US figures for carbon emission and for other kinds of solution declined quite substantially. And in various parts, there was also substantial expansion of wildlife in many places where it had declined. Recession, actually, is good for nature. Less economic activity is best of all from a nature's point of view. Meanwhile, President Obama devoted himself to achieving a national recovery. He dedicated himself to expanding growth once again, to rapidly increase bank loans. This is his program, was to rapidly increase bank loans, to see swift expansion of automobile sales, to see more and more housing starts on thus far open land, and to expand industrial activity to its former levels or beyond that. On this point of philosophy, choosing between expansion and the health of nature and carbon emissions, I regret to say that so far he's not one of us. It's expansion über alles. He may succeed in the short run or in spurts of growth, but again, as Heinberg says, the party's over. There's only so much expansion that's going to be possible on a planet of diminishing resources. With all of that as background then, it's not surprising that domestic and global negotiations on climate change are going very slowly. Congress is not passing any good climate bill. The nearest one to passage, which has some chance of passage, includes a massive carbon trading program, which is really a way of avoiding corporate behavioral change. I haven't decided whether I'm for that compromise or not. I think not. As for the international level, it looks something like this. The major industrial nations of the world are refusing to commit to major cuts in emissions until the United States Congress does it first. Since the U.S. is the world's largest emitter, they will not cut growth until we do it first. But neither the U.S. Congress or the President is committing to anything meaningful so far. Meanwhile, the United States and other industrial nations are demanding that third world countries make a clear commitment to emissions reductions before we do. We are trying to put the onus on new industrial nations like China and India to be first out of the box. But they point out that the U.S. has accounted historically for 40% of historical emissions, which should be viewed as a debt, they say, that we owe the rest of the world, and that the industrial world together has accounted for something like 70%. I might be wrong on that exact number. We need to cut first and more, they say. We refuse. No movement, no deal. Meanwhile, we've gotten most of our raw materials for this overproduction over the last century by basically stealing them from third world colonized countries. So how dare we now demand that poor countries announce their emissions cuts before we do, and that they should carry a heavy burden on this score? One of our colleagues is Martin Core from the Third World Network. I know some of you know that. He points out that in a world of diminishing resources where total supply is diminishing rapidly, that poor countries, which have always been promised that they were going to be developed and that eventually we would have equity, it's going to be ever more difficult for poor countries to get a piece of the ever diminishing pie. And that's part of why they're fighting so hard on this point of who goes first. But really it's all about who gets to continue to try to grow their industry versus who declines. Okay, finally, here's the good news. Sort of. One way or the other, we're going to get to 350 ppm because the resources of the planet, especially energy and water, are not sufficient to sustain industrial production at the present level. Governments are now fighting each other for the last crumbs of the industrial resources, but they're running out. I fear that we have to go through a period of terrible geopolitical trauma, wars and competitions for the crumbs, but that the present level of industrial society, the present level of industrial output is going to decline over the next several decades. In fact, I'm ready to promise you that. In fact, if you don't believe me, the New York Times yesterday had a very, very, very good story bringing together all of the conferences that are now going on among scientists, basically making that same point. And if you don't believe that, we have just published this terrific report, which actually Richard Heinberg is the author of, and I wrote the foreword and edited, called Searching for a Miracle. It's basically about analyzing all the alternative energy systems that are being proposed as substitutions for diminishing carbon. And from the point of view of net energy, that is to say, how much energy it costs versus how much energy you get for each of those 18 energy sources. And the net result is that some are better than others. Some actually are net energy losers, like, for example, biofuels and a few others. Probably the best alternative is wind, but no combination of alternative energy sources is going to come anywhere near being able to sustain industrial society at its present level. It's a pretty shocking result that basically is saying that we're searching for a miracle. If you want, you can. This is not yet up on our website, but it will be. But you can buy them. They cost $15, but you can download it free if you want from the IFT website in maybe a week. So the central question becomes this: will governments face these facts, join in agreements while there's still time to make sensible transitions on a global level to where the necessity to produce less, use less resources, achieve greater equity among what is left, or will be war? One way or the other, as a planet, we will be powering down. And by next century, we'll be below 350 ppm. Of course, we don't want to wait for that. Meanwhile, in communities like this, the process is ever more clear. We need to assess our resources, build a sustainable economy, which as much as possible remains free of global geopolitics, and achieves local food sovereignty, community control of corporate activity, democratic local governance, and equity among the peoples who live here. We're already well on the way to that, thanks to you all. And also, let's try to engage and influence our national and global leaders that they should see the handwriting on the wall and get with it now instead of later. It won't be easy for anyone, but we'll eventually get there. Thanks very much, and thanks for your attention.